Hello photographers, welcome to our lesson about depth of field. This week you guys are going to be learning how to control your cameras a little bit better so that you can take pictures showing different depths of field. So I'm going to tell you about what depth of field is, and then we're going to talk a little bit how you can control it so that you can take pictures that show that. So first of all, depth of field is the area between the nearest and farthest points of the camera that are acceptably sharp in focus. So what that means is it's essentially what's in focus in your picture. So you've all taken pictures before where you have maybe the background out of focus or the foreground out of focus. Some part of the picture is out of focus. And not because something is moving, because we just learned about how to control that with shutter speed last week. So this would be because of the aperture. So this is actually that area that your camera opening will gather. Because if you've noticed, if you hold your camera too close to something, it won't focus. And then sometimes you might have a background area that's out of focus. So that area that is focused is the depth of field. So that's what we're going to be learning how to control. So in this photo that we're looking at here, this is an example of great depth of field. So great depth of field is when the picture has everything in focus. So that means the foreground, the middle ground, and the background are all focused. So essentially, you can't find anything in the picture that looks like it's out of focus. So this is mostly used for landscape photos, and you'll see it done in other photos as well, snapshots and things that people are doing. But when it comes to artistic photos, it's more often applied to landscapes. The other kind of depth of field we're going to be working to capture is called shallow depth of field. And in shallow depth of field, the object that you want in the foreground is in focus, and then the background is out of focus. So this is used to help create a more of an emphasis point. So you're directing the viewer's eye to the precise place that you want it to go. So in this example, you're looking at a flower up close, and then the background, which had more kind of busy things going on in the background, is not in focus, so that you're not distracted by that background. So this is really common in portrait photography, so that you can see the subject and then not see the background. Also when you're looking at close-up type photos, like for example this flower, you see it a lot in wedding photography where the photographer is focusing on a detail like the rings or the flowers or maybe the champagne glasses or some sort of detail. So you see it in a lot of detail shots as well. So how this happens is by changing your aperture. So your camera has this opening in the lens called an aperture. Depending on your type of camera is going to depend on how your aperture works. So if you have a point and shoot or you're using your camera phone, your aperture has one set opening. It's not going to change, so you can't control it in those kind of cameras. In single lens reflex cameras, you can control how large or small your aperture opening is, so you can control in how much light comes in through that lens. There are ways to still get shallow depth of field with either type of camera. It's just going to be a little bit different. You do still need to know how it's controlled with an SLR type camera or a camera where you have control of the aperture, because I want you to understand how depth of field works and the controls that are available to you as a photographer. Even if you're not using an SLR camera right now, you might at some point, so it's really good to understand how this works. So your camera has this opening, and depending on how large or small the opening is, it's going to change the depth of field. It's going to change what's in focus and what's not in focus. Another term for aperture is f-stop. You don't hear that as much with some digital photographers, but you still do sometimes hear f-stops because each of the aperture openings is going to have a different number. And each of those different numbers is called an f-stop. So we're not going to get into that quite yet. So aperture and depth of field. Here is how your aperture controls your depth of field. So a small aperture is going to actually have more in focus. So that little teeny tiny opening, you're going to have more in focus. And then a large aperture, so a larger opening, you're going to have more in focus. So that small aperture is going to give you great depth of field where everything's in focus, and that large aperture is going to give you shallow depth of field. Now when I'm talking about large and small, I'm talking about the size of the opening, not the number on the f-stop or the aperture number itself. Okay, so here's an example of those f-stops. So that's what the little f next to the number means. It's for f-stop, which is the same thing as aperture, because aperture, if you were to look that up in the dictionary, means opening. So in f1.4, it's a small number, but it's a big opening. Okay, so it seems kind of backwards, but that's how it works. I'm not sure why they do it that way, but that's what they do. So the tiny number, so the F8 is going to be the smallest opening on this particular diagram here. Though if you have an SLR, most of your cameras are going to go down to a 2.8, and they might go even smaller. Okay, or sorry, I'm thinking the wrong way. They'll go to a F16, which would be a small opening. Sometimes you go to an F22, which is going to be a small opening. Some lenses even have an F32, which is going to be an itty-bitty little teeny tiny opening. And an F1.4 is usually the largest opening most cameras have. A lot will stop at 2.8 though. Okay, so it seems backwards. That F1.4 in this diagram is the largest opening. And remember, the large openings are going to give you a more shallow depth of field, so less in focus, and the large openings, sorry. And then the smaller openings are going to give you more in focus, okay? So the numbers are backwards, just think of that. And one way I kind of help remember this is when you take a picture indoors, you're actually going to end up having less areas in focus because your camera is going to need to open that aperture up to a larger size to make up for having less light. All right, so here is a diagram that's just kind of comparing depth of field here. So on the left, you see these flowers that have the flowers and the background in focus. So this is great depth of field. So it was shot at an f32, which is a teeny tiny little pinprick of an opening. Okay, and then shallow depth of field on the right was shot at an f5.6, which is a fairly large opening. So you can see the difference there in the background when you compare those two. So for this week, our assignment is going to be to create pictures that show shallow depth of field and great depth of field. So you're going to be doing that by either changing your aperture on your camera, if you can control that, or you're going to have to experiment a little bit if you've got a fixed aperture and just take pictures in different lighting conditions. If you have an iPhone or an Android or some sort of smartphone that you can download apps, there might be an app that you can find that can give you the illusion of depth of field, but we don't want to just blur out the background. We want to actually have it change because of our camera. So if you have the ability to change your shutter speed or your aperture, please experiment at every different aperture in kind of the same area this week when you take your pictures. If you are using your phone or a fixed aperture camera, a point and shoot that you can't change, I want you to take pictures in different lighting situations. So some indoors, some outdoors, and your camera hopefully will adjust for you a little bit. You're going to do the best you can with the camera that you have, and it's not going to be the end of the world if you don't get a perfect example of this. So this week, you are going to be shooting close-ups in nature, so like the flower examples that we looked at. So you're going to find it can either be man-made objects or it can be natural objects like flowers and things like that, or you could be taking pictures of, I don't know, mailboxes and sculptures and fire pits, and so find some things outside. If you are using a fixed camera, then you can take a few pictures indoors as well, but if you can control your depth of field or your aperture, please take all your pictures outside so you can have better lighting. Okay, so that is a little bit of an overview of depth of field and a little intro to your assignment. There will be another page explaining your assignment, but that is what we are doing this week. Please, please, please send me a message or call me or text me if you have any questions about this. Depth of field, I think, is one of the more complicated topics in photography. I know when I was in high school, I totally pretended that I understood how to do it, and I don't know how I got through it. It wasn't something I actually understood until I got to college and had it taught to me a second time. So please, please send me a message or call me or text me if you need help or you need me to explain it to you, or we need to figure out how to get it to work on your individual camera. Remember, I am here to help you, okay? If you want help in person, please schedule a time with me. This semester I'm on campus every Friday, so we might be able to get a time together for in person if you need that. That does take you close to your deadline though, so make sure that you're getting a hold of me if you need some help. All right, let's have a fantastic week.